Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for answering. That's nice. My name is Françoise Hamlin. I'm an associate professor in Africana Studies and History here at Brown, and I'm on the faculty advisory board of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. My work focuses on the Black freedom struggle in the United States, particularly in the 20th century, and I serve today as your moderator on this panel. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our panelists, who will give brief 10-minute presentations, followed hopefully by a 15-minute conversation between the panelists, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm sure there'll be a very rich discussion after what we're going to hear. So bear with me as I do my introductions of everyone, and people have amazing bios, so it was kind of hard to choose which parts to put forth. Mary Elliott is a museum specialist at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. She helped research, conceptualize, and design the Slavery and Freedom inaugural exhibition. She contributed to the exhibition script, consulted with expert scholars, and identified and secured collection donations, including the featured antebellum slave cabin. A graduate of Howard University and the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law, Ms. Elliott helped produce local history exhibits in the Washington, D.C. area and produced several public history programs. She served as a contractor and consultant to various organizations, including the National Visionary Leadership Project, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland African American History, and the Humanities Council of Washington, D.C. Meredith Hardy earned her BA from Indiana University, her MS from the University of New Orleans, and her PhD from Florida State University. She's an archaeologist in the Southeast Archaeological Center's Investigation and Compliance Division and has held field projects across the Southeast and the Virgin Islands. She provides support for Section 106 and Section 110 implementation, and for historic property protection and 106 compliance for oil spills and natural resource damage assessments. Dr. Hardy's research interests include island and coastal archaeology, colonial and plantation archaeology of the southeastern United States and the Caribbean, foodways, architecture, and colonial urban planning, and the development of Creole cultures, and has led archaeological investigations across the Southeast and the national parks of St. Croix in the US Virgin Islands. I think I'm going in order. Michael Hutchinson Frazier is the historian for the African Burial Ground National Monument, Manhattan Sites, and the Stonewall National Monument. He came to the National Park Service from UNESCO, and Mr. Frazier managed non-formal education, basic educational literacy programs situated globally. His undergraduate degree is from Brigham Young University, and he holds a Master's of International Relations and Diplomacy from Schiller International University in France, and a Master of Development Studies from the Institute of Social Studies in the Netherlands. Ibrahima Chow is a professor of archaeology for Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire, a research institute based at the University of Cheikh Anta Diop, Dakar, where he is the director of the Laboratory for Anthropology and Cultural Engineering. His research interests focus on the long-term impact of the Atlantic trade, craft production, culture contact, and archaeological study of identity and cultural heritage management. Over the past 15 years, he has directed several research programs on sites associated with Atlantic slavery and European colonization, including the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Gorée Island in Senegal, collecting comparative data on patterns of enslavement and their impact on local communities. He received a PhD in anthropology from Rice University, an MA in prehistory from the University of Paris in Nanterre, and an MA in history from the University of Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, Senegal. Lastly, Jennifer Tosh is the founder of the Black Heritage Tours. She is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley and currently resides in Amsterdam while working on a dual master's in heritage and memory studies. at the University of Amsterdam. The Black Heritage Tours began in 2013 to create positive narratives about the presence and contributions of the African diaspora in the Netherlands and Europe more broadly. She has built a sustainable business by collaborating with a team of scholars, historians, public officials, businesses, and heritage tourism professionals. And now there are tours also in Brussels and this year in New York State. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you all for coming. And let us begin with our first speaker. I think two are presenting together. Mm-hmm.
Good morning. It's early, right? For a Saturday. So I'd like to start by thanking our conference host for the very generous invitation to participate in this occasion. I feel very honored to be amongst some really dynamic scholars and professionals. Now, I have to take a little personal aside because I'm very excited to share with you that when I chose to go to my undergraduate school, I had 4 people ahead of me that were doing amazing things, and they attended Brown. They were 4 cousins, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and 3 of them are here today. So I want to acknowledge them in the audience along with my other cousin, Sherry. Yeah. So the funny thing is they said, have you heard about this conference? So it's my pleasure to be here, and I'm going to speak with you briefly about some of the work that I am doing with my colleague, Meredith Hardy, who is here representing the Park Service. And it really is focused on how we are doing community collecting down in St. Croix. And that is born out of the Slave Rex Project, which you may have heard a little bit about yesterday from Dr. Paul Gardulo. I would be remiss if I did not start by sharing with you, of course, that I'm Mary Elliott. I'm a museum specialist, and I had the honor of co-curating the Slavery and Freedom exhibition with my colleague, Dr. Nancy Burkaw, who presented yesterday. And I have to share that we also were assisted by dynamic scholar, Sion Wolden-Michael, who is working with us full-time, and she's also finishing her PhD at Harvard, as well as Dr. Rex Ellis, who many of you saw yesterday, and then, of course, I have to acknowledge Dr. Gardulo. So some of the things I want to talk to you about today include our response to the museum and the story of slavery and freedom, how it's been received by the public. The sacred space dedicated to the Middle Passage in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. This is very important because it speaks to some of our efforts to collect these stories and objects and to share them with the public in a dynamic way. And then also our community engagement model, which there are things that both Nancy and I did in our previous work, but also that we brought to bear doing work on the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, and it provided a framework for what we're doing down in St. Croix. And then lastly, how the Slave Rex Project is using this model and merging some of the activities that are done through the National Park Service to do community collecting down in St. Croix. St. Croix, the project that we're working on down there, the Slave Rex Project is we look at slavery through the lens of maritime archaeology, looking at the story of slavery and freedom. We first talked about the São José in our Middle Passage space in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition, but now we're spreading that story beyond the story of the São José and looking at communities in Mozambique, as well as in South Africa, in St. Croix, as well as looking at Cuba eventually, and working, collaborating on a few activities in Senegal. So some of you probably saw this image yesterday. Unfortunately, I missed the presentation from my colleague, Dr. Burkaw, but I just have to revisit this image so that I can give you some context for how we approach this activity. So, of course, this is an image of the history gallery in the museum, in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, one of 3 galleries, and the Slavery and Freedom exhibition is at the very bottom. It is foundational to this story and this journey of African American history and culture. You'll see that we have the expanse of history, the Tower of Cotton, which talks about the antebellum period, and the slave cabin. What I want to do is point out to you the story of the slave cabin, because that is one of the objects that we collected that very much involved giving us a framework for the community collecting initiative. Some of the themes that we look at in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition include, we try to make sure that from the very beginning we let people know that this is a story that is a human story and an American story. That was something that really came through yesterday through all of these presentations. This is a human story, an American story, and this is a shared history. I know we talked about that yesterday, and I'd like to expound on that a little bit more today as well. We look at profit and power juxtaposed against the human cost. We look at how people held on to their humanity under the most inhumane circumstances. We look at how Africans in the world and in America shaped the landscape and were shaped by the landscape, socially, economically, politically, demographically, culturally, and intellectually. And we also look at the harsh reality of slavery, as well as, and I can't emphasize this enough, the resistance, the resilience, and the survival of a people. We would be remiss if we told this story just from the harsh reality of slavery. How do you empower young people and even older generations to understand the importance of this story? You have to look at the full picture. And so we try to humanize this story while we show this through the African American lens. Remember, I said this is an American story and a human story. I'll give you a quick example. I don't have an image up here, but I need to share this with you. For example, in our story on the transatlantic slave trade, when I talk about a human story, and Nancy as well, we don't just look at that from the perspective of Africans. When we say this is told through an African American lens, African Americans looked out into a world that was interracial, right? It crossed class. It was a cross-section of people. So we look at the transatlantic slave trade and we have an object. It is it's the Fox's Wage Book. The Fox's Wage Book is a wage book that carries the information about the wages that were paid to crew members who served on a slave ship. When you look inside that book, you find out many people committed suicide, many people ran away. You find out what happened to their wages after they died, it went to their widows. But when we give a tour, we tell people, look at that wage book and think about, we're talking about a human story. That humanity applies to everybody, good, bad, or otherwise. So when you unpack that story and you look at that object and you think to yourself, 2 things. 1, everyone benefited from this slave trade. Everybody. Not just the people who invested in it, not just the planter elite, everybody. But the other thing we look at is, why would someone serve on a slave ship? You can look at it in many ways. 1, was it to get passage to the New World? 2, was it to feed their family? Or 3, did they think it was morally fine and they just wanted to make some money? So we try to help people really visit the different experiences of this story and see everybody in this story. We look at people across race and across culture, ethnicity, class. The Middle Passage story that we feature in the Slavery and Freedom exhibition allowed us to bring in some of those cross-section of voices and really humanize this story. So many people would think, well, Middle Passage, we're going to show some images, and we're going to have, there were people who asked us, are you going to have moaning? Am I going to know what it felt like to be on a slave ship? But one thing my colleague brought up, and it was a very powerful statement, is, and it's an obvious statement, how would any of us ever know what it was like to be on a slave ship? I don't care if I draw a box on the floor. I don't care if I let you put your arms in shackles. You will never know. So instead of doing images or giving people an opportunity to experience that, we carry that space with first-person voices. We dug deep to put quotes in the space as well as audio in that space to allow the visitor to be immersed in this story of the experience of the Middle Passage through the first-person voice. But you see, we paired it with objects, and those objects include ballast stones from the São José. The São José was a slave ship that started in Lisbon, traveled to Mozambique, picked up captive Africans on their way to be sold in Brazil, and ultimately crashed off the coast of South Africa in the 1790s. Through the work of Dr. Gardulo and his colleagues, Dr. Steve Lubkeman, as well as folks at Ezekiel Museum and the University of Cape Town, they were able to really identify the important pieces of this story, including looking at a manifest that included the fact that the ship carried 1,400 ballast stones used to offset the human weight of the ship. We're fortunate enough to have raised a couple of those ballast stones from the ocean floor and feature that in the exhibition. Now, we could show you just the object itself and tell you the facts about the object, but when you pair it with the quotes, it's really quite powerful, and it helps you really think of that object as representative of people. So it really gets to the story of captivity and commerce, right? And the human experience on that slave shipwreck. When we put the first-person voices in that space, we use the voices of not only Africans from the period who went through that Middle Passage experience, but also crew members, ship surgeons. So again, you get a multiplicity of voices, right? To also show the human cost and that profit and power, we have a wall that just shows the ship names going all along the wall so that people can see the vastness of this global enterprise. Now, thinking about the global enterprise, that gets me to looking at St. Croix, because how can we look at this story and just look at the story of profit and power, the human cost, just through the lens of what was going on in North America? We're connected. This is a global enterprise that we're talking about. So we have visitors go through, and it's a long wall that shows hundreds, which we know is just a mere chip off the block of how many ships were involved in this global enterprise. But thinking about the information that was presented yesterday about data and how do you humanize the data, we have the names of the ship, the country of origin, the day of embarkation, but we also look at the mortality statistics. So I can see the data, and it seems pretty straightforward, but the mortality statistics really bleed through and help you understand, that human cost. This is the Pointe-à-Pitre slave cabin. That's the slave cabin that I pointed out to you in our earlier image of the ground floor of the Slavery and Freedom exhibition. The Pointe-à-Pitre slave cabin, we collected from Edisto Island, South Carolina. We were in search of many objects to help tell this story of slavery and freedom. And myself and Dr. Ellis, we went down to South Carolina and we visited with community residents down there, told them what we were looking at and the stories we want to tell, and got their input on how we can tell this story, right? A young lady passed on the information that we were looking for a slave cabin, and we were fortunate enough to receive a call from folks at Edisto Island Historic Preservation Society, and they said, "We understand you're looking for a slave cabin. We think we might have something." So we went down, we looked at the slave cabin, we did an assessment. Of course, when I first looked at it, I said, "I'm not going inside of there are snakes and spiders." And then I went inside. And there were snakes and spiders. But what we did after that, once we did our assessment, we worked with the community. And Dr. Burgaw came on board, and it was a beautiful thing. Let me tell you that. In addition to working with the community, we worked with a genealogist. And again, that came up yesterday. Thank you, Kenyatta. We worked with a genealogist, and truth be told, the way I came to this project is I started doing research based on genealogy. There's a book called Black Roots by Tony Burrows, and he says you can know your family tree, but you really, in order to know the story, have to know the history, the local history and the larger history of the nation and the world. So we tapped a genealogist who offered her services for free to do research on the descendant community. Understand what descendant community means. We don't just mean descendant Black people. That means everybody. The plantation holders, the enslaved, free people of color, everybody. Yeoman white farmers, poor whites, Everyone who worked together to build a community, even in the midst of that inhumane situation. The young lady was able to pull together a group of descendants, and as we took down that cabin every single day, we had visitors on the site. Those visitors included descendants of the slaveholding family who still owned the Point of Pines plantation site, descendants of the enslaved associated with the community that lived in that home, which was built in the 1850s and lived in until the 1980s. No electricity, no running water, no heat. The beauty of it was there was organic conversation on the site, and it allowed us to unpack that human experience and the legacy of slavery in that site. And we made space for everybody's story, which is most important, because the key thing is everybody has a story. Now, I have to share with you, I wasn't there this day, but Nancy shared with me that when one of the gentlemen who was the descendant of the slaveholding family went to pick up a descendant of the enslaved community, they came by the site, and when they got out of the car, they both spoke Gullah. That says a lot, doesn't it? Because the power in that tells you that these folks, even through the generations, they knew each other's families. They built a community together. So when we talk about shared history, it is shared. It's very much shared. And they know each other's stories in ways that we don't, but we have the pleasure of sitting in and listening in on, right? And so that helps us tell these stories in more powerful ways. It personalizes it, it humanizes it, and it allows every visitor. The statistics of people coming into this museum is we opened September 24th. Tickets have been given out through March. We haven't even issued starting after March, and all the tickets that are free are gone. We give out tickets the same day at 9:15 a.m. People line up at 6 a.m. And the dwell time in the museum is normally 2 hours. It's 6 hours in our museum. The people who come are black, white, young, old, you name it. Because you see the makeup of all the people who came down for that day. We've since lost some of the folks who came down to the community. The young lady in the black and white shirt unfortunately passed a month before we opened, and she was pivotal to us getting that story. So now what we do in St. Croix is this same thing. We've taken that model and we've superimposed it on looking at the island of St. Croix. And we are now working with the community through community partners and collaborators. We've been hosting community meetings and doing the exact same thing to pull in community members and talk about the importance of the history of St. Croix and its connection to the global slave trade. This is not a slave cabin, it's an entire island I don't know the exact word I would use, but it is covered with sites of slavery, of sugar plantations everywhere you look. And so we are working with young people, we are working with the University of the Virgin Islands, we're working with the National Park Service, we are creating curriculum, summer internship programs. We are also working to create a field school this summer that will focus on terrestrial archaeology as well as maritime archaeology, partnering with the Diving with a Purpose team from the National Black Scuba Divers Association, as well as creating curriculum for the school system in UVI at the University of the Virgin Islands. That leads me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Meredith Hardy, who will carry this a little bit further and tell you about the details of those projects.
All right, thanks, Mary. Morning, everyone. I feel a little bit like a fish out of water here. Not an academic. I'm a simple little agency archaeologist who goes out in the woods and digs holes and everything. But every once in a while, I get pulled into a really neat project and get to do some really cool stuff and stretch my academic brain power just a little bit and remember, yeah, I did go to university at one point in life. Let's see, just to provide a little context before I jump into here. A lot of this work that we're doing down in St. Croix, it's tangent with the island's preservation, well, the Virgin Islands preparation to get ready for the 100th anniversary of the transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the United States. This happened in 1917, and it really hits on some of the topics that were hit on yesterday about citizenship and identity. Because what happened was that people are now dealing with these questions of what does it mean to be a Virgin Islander and what does it mean to be a U.S. citizen when they were essentially bought 100 years ago. Denmark sold the land, they sold the people to the United States for $25 million in gold bullion. They sold these people who were not quite 100% US citizens. They cannot vote for president, they have a non-voting member of Congress, she can introduce legislation, but they don't have the same rights as a full US citizen, and this goes for other US territories. So one of these questions that's coming up with this centennial is, what does that mean to be a US citizen? What does it mean to be a Virgin Islander? Do I feel like do I own my history? Do I own my own identity, or is it given to me by somebody else? And our work with Slave Wrecks Project really fits in perfectly with these kinds of questions coming up with the centennial. Our efforts to help tell these stories with our partners, with the Smithsonian, with George Washington University, with University of Virgin Islands, with other local partners, is really to get students involved, to help them start to define these stories for themselves, to learn their own history that they're not actually learning in school. They're learning mainland United States history. They're not learning Caribbean history or Virgin Islands history. And I'll mention it here in just a minute. When we're working with these student interns, this is the first time many of them have heard any of these stories about the history of the island itself and the history of enslavement. They have the stories of memory that come down through their families, but they don't actually have the grounding, the academic grounding, to actually help make sense of a lot of this stuff. So we're helping set these stages for future partnerships and future development with the University of Virgin Islands for exhibits, for curricula, for all kinds of things that are coming up in the next few years. Through a memorandum of understanding that we have with the university. So we have many ways to reach out and work with this partnership, and hopefully, several years ago, there was a special resource study, is what we call it, to turn the entire island into a national heritage area. And it met all of the criteria, and now we're just waiting on Congress, so write your congressman. Let's get this thing passed. But what that does is that opens up many more doors and corridors of opportunity for Park Service and other federal agencies to work with local communities to help really start bringing these stories out. We won't be confined to just government-owned land or National Park Service land. We can work anywhere and provide that kind of funding support. So that's the background for what we're doing here on St. Croix for the Slave Wrecks Project, terrestrial and underwater archaeology, just so everyone knows where we are. The red dot is where we are. We have 3 National Park Service units on the island. This is Buck Island Reef National Monument, which is where we've been doing all of our underwater stuff. We have 2 slave wrecks that we know crashed on the reefs out there in those waters. This is Salt River Bay National Historic Park and Ecological Preserve, where Christopher Columbus dropped anchor. It's the only place on U.S.-owned land where Christopher Columbus showed up, dropped anchor, sent some men on board, and it's the first recorded conflict between Europeans and indigenous Amerindians that we know. It's not the first conflict, but the first recorded one. And then right here is Christiansted, which is where we're concentrating our land efforts. A little background on the underwater. Here are the shipwrecks, the 2 that we know of, that we have been working with the Submerged Resources Center for the National Park Service to conduct magnetometer surveys of those waters to find evidence of the shipwrecks. And we have found a lot of stuff. We found a lot of anchors and chains, and a couple of these anchors actually date to the correct time periods for these wrecks. So our future efforts not really ground truthing, but water truthing, for these sites is to see, do we have any evidence of actual wrecks themselves? And we will be working with students, teaching them, working with Diving with a Purpose to actually teach these skills and getting them out there to start doing this kind of survey. Okay, 5 minutes of a lot of stuff to do. All right, so here's Christiansted. These are the historic buildings. They're all built in the middle to late 1700s. Purpose is to build local capacity and field heritage management. Introducing University Island students to some of these really basic kinds of ideas like historical research, archival research, collections management. These programs just don't exist at the university there. Teaches critical real-world skills for archaeology and other worlds of cultural resources, heritage management. And then it also provides a venue for the interns to let the world know about their experiences. They're blogging, they're doing social media, they're making videos, interpretive posters that we use in our exhibits there in the fort, which is the main headquarters there at the park. And then we get some stuff too. You know, we manage resources, so we get baseline documentation, and it allows us to better serve as stewards for the resources there on the island. So we use several students. Last year we had 5 actually. They work with us on all aspects of the project, including analysis and curatorial stuff. We've already talked about that. So a little history, 1754, the Danes have come in, they bought the land in 1734 from the French, and they've started building forts and other buildings associated with customs and weighing and getting ready for the big trade in sugar. Oops, wrong way. 1760, not a whole lot has changed as far as the wharf development, but you're not seeing all the other buildings. This is just an inventory map for the government. By the 1770s, 1780s, this is the Guinea Company Warehouse Complex. This is where everything's coming in, being weighed, taxes are being levied, and some slaves are actually being brought in before they are distributed to private places where then they are sold across the island. There are slave quarters here in this complex, and that's what we are excavating. By 1803, there have been some changes in the complex. So that all helps make the archaeology really complicated because you're in an urban area and there's changes all the time going to the landscape. So here are the slave quarters, are circled. And then here's an overlay, just seeing what it looks like today on the modern landscape. There's been a lot of changes. So we were down there for another project, and we said, hey, let's run some radar. We got this really nifty radar unit, let's run it, let's see if we see anything in the ground before we start digging. Because there's nothing like being a new student to archaeology and not finding anything when you put a hole in the ground. So we want to make sure we find good stuff for them. So we ran radar over all of that, over a good chunk of the 7 acres. And we found stuff. We found buried utility lines, which is good for the management side, but we also found evidence that lines up pretty good with the historic maps for the historic structures. 1779 building, there it is, it's lining up pretty good with those slave quarters there, and then with the changes in 1803, we have them lining up over there. Okay, so summer, we brought in our students, and only one of these had any archaeological experience whatsoever, so we're starting from ground zero, and they learned it really, really quick. We did have one, Gitta. She was actually from University of Aarhus in Denmark. She was thrown upon us, and she's awesome. She's actually building an exhibit right now for us down there for part of her master's work. The other 3 down there, Akeem, Jordan, and TR, were University of Virgin Islands students. But we had to teach them archaeology, so we threw them in the bush at first, and we did some field work at the 1790 well tower where we needed to find the well. And they did some digging, and we found the well. So they learned all the basics about digging and uncovering a site and site recordation. We found some other structures too out in the woods. That's where we're going to go next summer, and we believe it's tied with the whole complex down there. So then we got to work in the park, which is in an urban area, so we get up to 40, 50 people stopping by a day asking us questions. And the students are the one answering the questions. They've got to own it. They've got to be engaged with the people coming around and asking, well, are you looking for gold? Saying, no, we're not looking for gold. So we started digging, and we found parts of these structures. We've got post holes and parts of foundations, which is part of this building right here. Okay. And then a graduate student from University of Tulsa was also working with us. She put a unit in right here. This is actually the bakehouse as part of the complex, and we have ash, we have the foundations of the bakehouse, and the students are really excited because they actually got to say, hey, this stuff works. We worked also with local high school students, part of the Youth Conservation Corps. They come in and they work with us all summer long. They help take out trash and do painting and other things. They learn some good toughening up skills. Life is more than just watching TV all the time. And so they got to come in and dig with us and help clean the artifacts and learn a little about it. And you could see that spark getting in there, like, I've never thought about this aspect of my history before. I want to know more. And you could really see the ones who are engaging, and they're actually trying to sign up now to work with us this coming summer for our excavations. We're going to be opening up more parts. We've already identified where we want to open up new units and hopefully get a lot more people involved. I'm out of time. So it's an awesome project. Because you can actually see people learning. You can actually see that spark clicking when people are connecting with their past, when they're actually holding the artifact. It's not some theoretical thing that they're reading in a book. They're saying, somebody made this piece of pottery out of the clay that got dug up over there, and they used it and they worked with it every single day. They cooked with it every day. It was theirs. And then I can say, this is a piece of my history. To make that point of connection as an archaeologist, it makes me feel good about the work that I do, that we're actually making a difference. So I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting. Which is a very good opportunity for exchange. I will be discussing my experience working on slavery in Senegal, the different parts of the country. And there are certainly local perspective, particularly for anyone working on the African continent. The issue of slavery can be as complicated as anywhere else around the world. And as much as in the Americas, slavery certainly shaped our modernity, and of course poses issues of deep moral and political significance. Even the economic disparities that are so visible in the Americas, for instance, are of course very visible in Africa. The kind of landscapes slavery created also are an important feature, and it is disguised in contemporary power relations. And like anywhere else, it still haunts us in unsuspected and complicated ways. Deflecting slavery is certainly, when you look at it in general, you realize that you have the impression that yes, in many instances slavery is deflected. In many instances it is silenced. People don't want to talk about it. And particularly for the case of Senegal and in West Africa at large, generally, slavery is an ascribed status, and people who may be very successful economically or even politically, but who are still really considered as slaves, not even as slave descendants, but are looked at as slaves, which is a very powerful thing. So in view to that, also the way history is viewed generally in certain milieu, some would think, no, it's not African history, and it has interrupted African history. It is part of African history. So I think that denial is not certainly the best way of dealing with this. If we, as Alan Zinn pointed out, if we don't know our past, we'll have to trust our politicians. And something that happened in Senegal about 3 years ago. A now still president, the one on your left, was accusing the one who succeeded him as being a slave descendant. And it was a major issue in Senegal, but an issue that academics were a bit afraid of addressing while it was taking place. But the funny thing about this story wasn't just simply the accusation per se, but the fact that the president who was accused to be a slave descendant was very eager to prove himself that he was not a slave descendant, he was not a slave, but he was from a family of slave owners, that he owned slave. And that man on the right bottom was considered to be one of the slaves that were owned by the president's family. And he was caught in the media saying that he was very angry as a slave of the president, that the president was accused to be a slave descendant while he wasn't. So it's very complicated. You just don't know sometimes how to handle these things. And of course, as I said, most of us are academics who are really afraid to address this issue. So I just want to go now to some of my research in southeastern Senegal, the polity of Beledikou, where we collected the story of a slave who would be king, and then was later toppled by a group of warriors who probably weren't slaves, but were probably caste people. And once they toppled that slave, they banned all the descendants of the alleged slave king so that they wouldn't occupy any political function. And this is taking place in the 19th century. And until today, and in most of the villages, or almost all of them, were still, the villages chiefs were selected among the Sissoko lineage that toppled the slave king. And the descendant still, until now, cannot be village chief. And the most shocking moment in all of that was that we come across a number of people, but this particular individual here with one of my graduate students, we were interviewing him, and every time we wanted to talk to him, there was a crowd coming to sit, to listen, and we felt that he was a bit intimidated, so we had to drive away so that he could speak freely. But even though we did that, he maintained that he was a descendant. He was not even a descendant, he was a slave, and he was proud to be a slave. And I asked about his children, how they would feel about this. He said, they have to accept it. I said, why? This is who we are. This is our identity. This is our status. I think, okay. Then the thing is that when these political debate, when this debate among politicians were taking place, these presidents were not talking, they were not addressing this issue for us in the academia. They were talking to these kinds of people who accepted this, who thought this was all too normal. It makes it very troubling that in many places, actually, people still would call themselves slaves and would say they accept it. This is in the same area. There is one part of the region that is, which has quite a few hills, very difficult access area. That is people by people known as Bassari Bedict, communities that are listed on the World Heritage list of UNESCO now. But when I come across, this was in 2011, when I come across this, this flyer here, it was shocking to me because I mean, for a long time, I mean, this is a community that is well known, well studied, but these aspects of their life, their relation to slavery hasn't really been dealt with. And they live on high elevations. And when I saw that Senegal is our country also, I thought this was a very powerful thing. But again, this can get very personal. This is at another site, this time for the West site, I think was, at least from oral tradition, associated to my own family. And there have been a number of intervention on the site, taking material from the site. So when I went there confronting this old man, he was telling a totally different story. But I mean, this would be a long story that I would discuss later. So really, slavery, if we want to confront it, I think that there are certainly multiple ways, and this is certainly what we should be doing. And sites that are related to slavery are certainly, until today, if we visit and we do the work properly, are sites of knowledge production as we interact with local communities. And of course, there is we can use the archives of the past, material culture, or written document record to address the issue of slavery, and via activism, education as well. So when you look at this, clearly, every generation and every nation reinvents its past, and slavery can certainly be silenced but not easily forgotten. And the main site where slavery is exhibited in Senegal is the Maison des Esclaves, which is that structure and at the bottom. But again, the kind of story it tells is a bit unusual. I'm gonna go quickly to the Maison des Esclaves, as we have this site where many different communities, nationalities, racial identities can claim parts and parcel of the story. How would you exhibit slavery in a way you can satisfy each of these communities? I was just looking at the Gore guest book, visitor's book, and I discussed very quickly in 1 minute the tension that exists between African American visitors and African visitors. Here, for African American visitors, and these are quotes from that book, memory is very powerful. It is very important to them when they come here. It's one of the most the strongest thing that you will feel when you read the visitor's book. In some of these quotes are from there. But when you look at the African visiting, what they put in the guest book usually, they are more concerned about African economic loss, which has something to do with the economic situation of Africa today. I'm not sure, but that's their main concern. So we have those sharp contrasts in between visitors, and of course, Europeans also are stakeholders and have their own view, but that's a different story. So again, to wrap it up, it's if we're dealing with it, if you want to exhibit it, I think that there's going to be certainly a great deal of utopia as well as dystopia, depending on which side we are. So how to reconcile with our past? Silence it or confront it. I think that the museum is a very good place to really confront that past. But again, that means that the museum certainly gotta be, for sure, when it comes to issues like this, a place of tension that we'll have to deal with. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Michael Frazier. I'm the historian for the African Burial Ground National Monument. We are grateful for the national parks to be invited to this event. It's essential and it's absolutely necessary. and I'll go into that later on. My journey with the burial ground began in 2004 while working on 55 Water Street in Lower Manhattan. I volunteered at the burial ground for 11 years before I was hired as a historian for that site 3 years ago. I think it is necessary to administratively position the African Burial Ground National Monument within the structure of the United States. The National Park Service falls within the umbrella of the United States Federal Executive Department, or the executive branch of the federal government of the United States. The heads of federal executive departments, known as secretaries, their respective departments form the traditional cabinet of the United States executive body. Each secretary serves or is appointed by the president to participate in the government as an advisory body to the president. We just had an election, as you all know, and the Department of Interior will receive a new Secretary of Interior. We are hopeful, and we will move forward. As civil servants, we will continue to do that. Now, it's also necessary to contextualize my responsibilities as a historian for the National Park Service. The National Park Service in the Northeast region, Manhattan sites, is listed within the Northeast region. Within the Northeast region in Manhattan sites, I have 8 sites that I'm the historian for. We'll start from the lower tip of Manhattan. I have Castle Clinton National Monument situated in Battery Park. I have Federal Hall National Memorial located on Wall Street. I have the African Burial Ground National Monument on Broadway between Duane and Reed Street. I have Theodore Roosevelt's Birthplace National Historic Site on 28th East 20th Street, which is the Gramercy Park neighborhood. We have now a newly acquired, added national park called Stonewall, which is Stonewall National Memorial, which is on Christopher Street in Sheridan Square. Further up north, I have Hamilton Grange, the National Memorial in St. Nicholas Park. And on the upper west side of Manhattan, I have General Grant National Memorial, on Riverside Drive, which is on 122nd Street. There is one more in Mount Vernon, which is St. Paul's Church, a colonial church situated in Mount Vernon. It's been 25 years since the rediscovery of the African burial ground. Most of us here are aware of the history, but I thought it would be useful to revisit that history briefly. The United States General Service Administration, GSA, in 1986 undertook construction of a courthouse and office building located at Foley Square in Lower Manhattan. In accordance with the provisions of the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy, GSA retained consultants to prepare an environmental impact statement. Within the environmental impact statement, a Stage 1A cultural resource survey was completed to identify known and potential cultural resources which might be affected by the construction. The burial ground was clearly labeled in 1755, I'm going to destroy the Dutch name, the Mareschalk Plan of New York. Mareschalk's plan was included in the environmental impact statement. The extent to which the human remains remained in the ground, it was unknown. Evacuation undertook at the time by archaeologists for the specific purpose of looking for such remains. And the location chosen was quite deliberate. So the remains were uncovered in a spot targeted by archaeologists at the corner of Republican Alley, a small street laid out atop the burial ground in 1795. It was considered a likely spot for preservation of burials and was therefore singled out for the archaeological testing. Now, the Negro burial ground, which is what the site was called on Mareschalk's plan, was in use during most of the 18th century and possibly as early as the 17th century. This was in the vicinity where many free Africans had been granted farms during the 17th century. New York at the time had the largest colonial slave population north of Maryland. Between 1732 and 1754, enslaved Africans accounted for more than 35% of the population. Now, once the remains were discovered, strong active community engagement by the descendant community, the city officials of New York, the government officials in DC, specifically Gus Savage, steered the direction of control of how history is to be recounted, how to memorialize intact skeleton human remains. The site went forward. I'll give you brief dates. April, it became a National Historic Landmark. In October, the skeletal remains which were removed were sent to Howard University to be researched, and they were brought back and reinterred in 2003. President George Bush, by proclamation, designated the African Burial Ground the 123rd National Monument in February of 2006. The exterior memorial, which was created by Rodney Leon, who will speak today, was completed in 2007, and the interior memorial was completed in 2010, the Interpretive Center. Now in December, the research library will be completed, hopefully in December, which will create availability for public utilization, allowing social scientists and individual researchers the accessibility to investigate African American history through original source documents. Now, the rediscovery of the African Burial Ground in 1991 changed the historical paradigm of slavery in the North, in New England as well as in New York. The burial ground reflects the establishment at an early date of a society almost parallel of enslaved Africans to white Americans in New York City, one of the largest urban African populations in the American colonies during the 18th century. Now, the burial ground, its origin stems, we feel, from Trinity Church, which received its charter and land title in 1697. In that same year, the church declared that Africans would no longer be buried in its churchyard, which had formerly served as a burial ground for paupers. Now, we're discussing living history and the memory of history. What I love about the burial ground, because I strongly feel that it's impossible to forget the living history and the memory of the burial ground for some specific reasons. First of all, the location of the burial ground. Where the site is now, when it was in use, it was not hospitable, and the colonists did not want to use it. An area of little desire, which became a spiritual haven for enslaved and freed Africans to carry out worship with dignity and respect stemming from funerary practices of the African continent. The physical conditions which we have images which are not correct, but they are images of the burial ground as a flat area, which it was not. It was in a ravine next to the Collect Pond, and this enabled Africans to practice the cultural spiritual rituals away from the visibility and safety away from the intervention. Now, when the remains were discovered, they were often stacked on top of each other. This was because we buried our dead on top of each other against the side of a hill. Now, there's some interesting aspect of the physicality of the burial ground, which I think still leads today. The deep bedrock found in the area between Midtown and Lower Manhattan has a profound effect on the city's growth. If you look at Manhattan right now, you'll see very large buildings below the burial ground, which are very tall on the tip of Manhattan, and you'll have very tall buildings in Midtown, which is above the burial ground. Well, during that time, in recent times, the foundations of skyscrapers were expensive or impossible to build because their footings had to be anchored in the bedrock. As a result, most large buildings were built north and south of this locale. More recently, modern foundation design has overcome many of the problems associated with deep bedrock, and it's now feasible to construct larger buildings. Secondly, the lowest point in the area between Midtown and Lower Manhattan was a sink right next to the burial ground for freshwater surface streams and numerous springs. The Collect Pond, it is possible that there was a meadow next to it called Lipsonard's Meadow, was a tidal estuary because in times of high tides, that was coupled with strong winds, both the wet meadows and the Collect Pond would flood, making Lower Manhattan an island. So the burial ground was protected Often through high tides, the lower Manhattan would become an island, and as the city moved northward, the burial ground was not destroyed because it couldn't build in the bedrock where the enslaved Africans' remains were held. During the exterior memorial dedication designed by Rodney Leon, I'm out of time? Wrap up, okay. Well, on page 5, so I should finish quite quickly. This takes me back to the physicality and the memory of the burial ground. I will continually say that it's quite difficult to forget the memory of the burial ground. Rodney, hopefully he's not here, but hopefully he will talk about the construction of the memorial. If you go to the burial ground, it's in a very high, secure section of Lower Manhattan. The burial ground is around 0.6 acres, the exterior memorial. As 1 foot outside of the burial ground, you will encounter intact skeletal remains. So the city, to this day, underneath the pavement, underneath the sidewalks, and underneath the building, there are still between 7,000 to 8,000 intact skeletal remains which stay and are resting underneath the city of Manhattan. So it's impossible for us to forget and to change the memory of that. One last thing, during Rodney Leon's the dedication of the memorial, Maya Angelou came, and it was quite an exceptional event. There were lots of dignitaries there, and everyone spoke of the closure, the ending, putting the past to rest, moving forward. Let's all try to use this time period as a healing process. Well, Maya Angelou had a different explanation. She was quite exceptional. She came to the event, she brought her own chair, she used it, and she said, "This is the beginning." She was the only one that said this, and I was there, and I can remember standing and looking at her thinking, wait, you're the only person that said this. She said, "We do not know the history. We do not know the history yet." And I feel strongly and hopefully as a historian for the site that we move in that direction of we are still learning the history of the site. We are still learning through research. We're still learning and working with Cobb Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. They have our soil samples. DNA has progressed so much that with the soil samples that were taken out of the burial ground, they're able to test the DNA to find out the origins of where that grave, that individual, that enslaved African came from. I think it's absolutely important to work together with academia. We have 8 sites that we have to manage, and it's quite a lot, so it is necessary and it's absolutely pertinent that we work closely together to push the memory forward, to have the history move forward, and for you guys to do the heavy legwork intellectually on the site, because there are constraints, some constraints, but the time allotted to do in-depth research and long-term research, it's absolutely necessary to continually partner with academia. Thank you very much for inviting the National Park Service.
I'm going to start while she's setting up because I don't want that to go against my 10 minutes. Just want to say good morning, first of all. Oh, that was too fast. Okay. I want to thank the committee, Shauna and Tony Bogues and the Smithsonian and Yale for assembling this amazing 3 days together, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. And I want to acknowledge our timekeepers because I think they've been doing a great job, right? Yeah. I'm hoping that buys me a few points because I only have 20 slides to get through my 10 minutes, so maybe you can be a little more lenient. Anyway, my name is Jennifer Tosh, and just a tiny little background about myself because I got a lot of people who've asked me, how did I live in the Netherlands and I don't have that accent that people are used to hearing. So the short version of my story is I was born in New York. My parents were immigrants in the 1960s from Suriname by way of Aruba, which was part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And so I was the first generation of my family born in the US. Fast forward
40 plus years later, I went to study abroad in the Netherlands as an exchange student. We called ourselves OWLs, older, wiser learners. The gray hairs are here to prove that. And I am still studying. I end up staying and creating an institution. I think it's a new institution, it's safe to say, about the black presence in the Amsterdam in particular, and more broadly throughout the Netherlands. And it came about as a result of what was missing in that national narrative. I was told while I was in school that there really wasn't any black presence. There was no black history in the Netherlands. It really was out there in the colonies. And that really erased a part of my own heritage, as I was also there doing genealogical research to retrace my family roots that had come from Suriname. My parents, my ancestors all hailed from Suriname, South America. So this was a journey for me that evolved into what has become an enterprise and a much larger. Okay, now let me do this. Do I just go forward? I am low tech, so let's make sure. I love this slide because it speaks about a future for the past. And that's really the space in which I love to occupy. I think everything that we can talk about today has a history. And part of that story really comes from the lived experience, the material heritage, the culture. And what I found really fascinating when I started doing my research was there were so many people that did not know about our own history, my family included. And I know that scholars and historians write a lot about these topics, but they generally, we talk to each other. And it doesn't reach that general audience. So that was an important first step. But there's a bigger picture, and I want to make sure I acknowledge that. I'm a part of a group called Mapping Slavery, and 3 of the 4 of us are here, or no, 4 of the 5 of us, I should say, are here. And I want my team to stand up, or at least wave your hands so that you can be acknowledged. Dinika Stam, Nancy Yawa, Dinka Hondias, myself, and Anna Marie, I know you're watching live on Facebook. Hi. And we really came together with a mission to broaden this narrative beyond just the single story, as Chimamanda Adichie talks about. And the Mapping Slavery Project was initiated in 2013, Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, to be a real transnational interdisciplinary research project. We have 1 publication under our belt, the Amsterdam Slavery Heritage Guide, which I'm shamelessly plugging right now. That was published in 2014, and we are soon to launch our 2nd publication. Let me show you that too, sample pages. In 2017, really the focus of our new publication is about mapping Dutch New York. There are also other initiatives that are part of this project that are maps, books, tours throughout the Netherlands. People really are surprised to learn about traces of slavery in Utrecht, which was Nancy Yawa's first, really introduced that project, co-wrote that book, Haarlem, Dinika, The Hague, and most recently Groningen. And the broader story really ties all of this together. Partnerships is really important to us as well, collaborating and bringing together unlikely global partners in academia, heritage tourism, government agencies, descendant communities, as was already said, not just the descendant of the enslaved, but the descendant communities of the enslavers or the owners, plantation owners, et cetera. And that's just a small list of some of our global partners, and there's this lovely picture that I love here of all of us together. Now, I will say, just because we live in the Netherlands does not mean that we all get high. I want that to be clear. However, we do look somewhat euphoric in this picture, especially me, and that's because we had just launched our book. But, so that's why this sort of glow. I thought people must think that we are doing something there, but we are just happy. We are very, very happy. Okay, moving on quickly. Also, the space that we occupy is experiential cultural heritage tourism. And this is really the fastest growing sector of tourism. And I love all of the presentations that have come before me because I'm really coming to you as a practitioner, a cultural heritage professional, also want to be a scholar and historian, writer, etc. But I want to share with you the experience that your work has on the general public. About the tour itself that really launched just this August this year in upstate New York. It's the really connection between Native American, African, and Dutch heritage. And it's the first of its kind that really tries to link all of these narratives together. The theory being that you cannot talk about New York unless you talk about the early, the Native American presence that was here first, and the Dutch, who were the first to really colonize what is now New York. You cannot talk about that without talking about the bringing in the African presence to help build New York State as we know it today, and really trying to provide a link. What are the connections? What is it that we can learn about this? We travel throughout the state, starting in the capital, in Albany, and travel throughout the Hudson River Valley, and ending in New York City, to sites of memory, to locations that are still alive with history. And that is one of the most amazing things. I say one of my favorite lines in this, it's not just a tour, it's a pilgrimage. And you'll see why really shortly. And here's a really fun slide that shows that history traveled. It didn't just start here or there, as we tend to refer to it. It had a trajectory. And this map, this image really shows at the top right, publications that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, but families that originated in the Netherlands that either traveled themselves to establish their territories, to expand their wealth in the New World, or sent their family members, and then linking to New Netherland, present-day New York, to these sites of memory where we go to visit what is the remains of this colonial past, or that still tells us something about the story. And some magical things happen for people that take this journey. Here's a few tour afterthoughts. Overwhelming, emotionally inspiring, artistically transformative, life-impacting. My time in Amsterdam really helped to set the tone for this weekend because I've had people who've taken the tour in Amsterdam, because that's what started the whole thing, and then have traveled here to do the tour in New York. To dive into our shared history in a group creates a special awareness of who we are, how we are all connected, and reminds me of one of the pillars from my upbringing, Fusabi Peyu Ego, Yumisabi Peyu Gomopo, and that is Surnan language. Surinamese for to know where you are going, you have to know where you come from. Another very emotional and powerful, yet also entertaining and fun. The emotional aspects came with the interactions, because of the interactions with the group. So it's meant to be dynamic, it's meant to be immersive and interactive, conversations, people sharing their own stories. There were these unexpected moments like Denise Jana, who is one of our premier jazz performance in the Netherlands, sang and did an impromptu libation ceremony, and that was really amazing and very, very emotive and emotional for people. To get into some of the outcomes of this experience, there are two sides to every story. I love this slide too. And what I want to just share a couple of cases with you of the interventions that the community, the people who actually go to these historic sites, what it is that they encounter. So one of those is Kralo Historic Site. It is in Rensselaer, which is near Albany, New York. And it has a very extensive Dutch history, as also Native American and African presence. They have a current exhibition called A Dishonorable Trade that really focuses on the Dutch history. And they're very proud, as a matter of fact, they were the beneficiary of the Yale program that they came to for, I think it was a one-week immersive program that helped them to really understand the full scope. Richard and his wife were very much a part of that, and they were extremely proud because the result of their experience at Yale helped them to produce this exhibition. So you see there on the lower left is actually Kralo in the Netherlands. And here again, these linking of histories and geographies. And there on the lower right are people, guests, walking through the exhibition in the actual house. Now what happens, I have found in my experience, is that people really go to these historic sites to find some connection to their own identity. And so as we're walking through, this image on the left appeared, and there were these placards throughout the house that were just sort of those signposts. And it read, in 2002, Queen Beatrix unveiled the National Monument to the Victims of Slavery as a way of I can't read that, what that says. There you go, you see that, okay. Now, when you first see this, if you're from the Netherlands and you know this history, you're immediately taken aback because there's something missing. And so I mentioned it to the curator. I said, you know, I know you want this to be well received and you expect a lot of visitors to come. Yes, but there is some text that's missing from this. And then I shared that, and they were very, very concerned and wanting to make sure they got it right. So when I brought another group back about 3-4 months later, they actually changed the text to what's now on the right. And the issue was there was the descendant community that were kept out of the opening ceremony. And so that changed the dynamics of that memorial. So to mention that one little segment actually engaged a whole nother audience of people, and that's what they did on the right. I won't read the whole thing because I'm running out of time, and I want to just show you just quickly some images of us. The difference between going to a real national museum or an institution like the Smithsonian and these house museums or these smaller museums is we get to actually touch the history. Now, you can't do that at the Smithsonian because you've got thousands of people walking through, but when we're at these smaller house sites, these experiences are much more tangible. You can touch the documents of these freedom seekers. You can touch the documents of the Emancipation Papers or even the slave notices that appeared. We go to actual grave sites where the original grave sites of these descendants, of these ancestors are buried and can actually come into contact with some of that. Now, this is my second most favorite thing. I went twice already to the National Museum, the Smithsonian, the new museum. I spent 2 full days and I still didn't see everything. I took over 350 pictures and I'm still trying to comb through these pictures. And my famous selfies, so there's me. Now, these men on the right were blind. Now, my favorite thing about the museum is that the families of generations talking to each other and engaging in a dialogue. And when I saw these blind men, I thought, and everybody else kind of jaw-dropping moment, well, what are they going to do? I mean, how are they going to do it? Because is there Braille? I mean, I was so fascinated. Of course, I went up to them and asked them, I just want to know, what does this experience mean to you to be here? You're non-sighted. It's like, we would not miss seeing this for the world. And even though we can't literally see these objects in this, we know we're in the place where our story is being told. I mean, that just was so exciting for them. And I followed them around for a while because I just wanted to see, how does this happen? And they had guides who were reading the text to them. And they, as much as they could, were places that they could actually touch something, they were willing to do that. It just was, they were so full of joy, so I had to take that picture, and of course, with their permission, they allowed me to do that. All right, I'm wrapping up. Last thing is the interventions. Walking through the museum, here is this a hall about the slave trade, and I've already talked to Nancy about this, and she was so willing to listen, and that is the most important thing to share with these institutions, is listening to your audience. It's one thing to create these exhibitions, but if you're not willing to listen to the feedback, to what people have to say, then what are you doing it for? And so here was a moment when you're walking through, and to see the Netherlands there, I mean, wow, this is great, right? 1619, 1814, oh, that was an arresting another moment. For those of you from the Netherlands, you know why I'm thinking that. I'm thinking, okay, where's the context? Where's the information to tell you what do these dates mean? Because 1814 is the end of the slave trade, but was not the end of slavery. And if it doesn't say that somewhere, people walking by think, that was much earlier than I thought. So that was an opportunity. And so what I wanted to say about that is, thank you, Nancy, for your openness to hear that message and to take that in and to work with it. I mean, however that might alter this moment for people who don't know, because most people believe whatever they see. And they're looking for a validation that this history is the history. It is their history. So I just want to leave you with a short quote and to thank you again for allowing me to share this very briefly with you. I've learned a lot from all of you this last 3 days. I've learned some new ideas: anxious politics, differentiated histories, reparations politics, memory tourism, ghost tourism. I've never even heard of that before. Imagination bondage. That was really great, wasn't it? Imagination bondage, freeing ourselves to be able to think imaginatively about this history. I'll make a quick quote and then I'll be done, by James Baldwin. He said, American history is longer, it is larger, more various, more beautiful, and more terrible than anyone has ever said about it. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of the day. Oh, I have to say quickly, we have a symposium tomorrow, Monday in New York City that you're all invited to, those of you that are in the area. It is a Mapping Slavery Project symposium where we're going to introduce and also share sample pages of our new book. It's at the West End Collegiate Church from 6 to 8:30. If you'd like to attend, it is a free symposium. Just send me an email to info@Black Heritage Tours, and we hope that you'll visit our websites and become a partner with us in this journey. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you to all our panelists. As you can see, we didn't go in order, but it wasn't chronological anyway at the time, so it didn't really matter. I wanted to make sure everyone was able to get up and flow through. So thank you, all of you, for all the work you do making this history and research accessible to more people while you are still in the process of uncovering more work and more histories and more stories. I think many of you made the point that it's very important in academia that the work that we do is accessible, and that these collaborations between those who are unearthing, sometimes literally, right, these histories, and those of us who write this stuff up in books that sometimes stay on shelves, that we collaborate more and make this work accessible to more people, whether it's in museums or just the very basic work of bringing students to that site, to the sites, and to these spaces. So particularly given that it's so vital that in educating our citizens and in undermining the very strong tide of anti-intellectualism that has taken over, I'm going to leave it at that, that this work is really important in sort of educating in different ways outside of the classroom. So thank you all for doing this work. And what was very striking to me, we were going to have a discussion amongst each other, but we're running out of time, and I really think it's more important.
Not my fault.
It's really important that we entertain the questions, and I think in that we'll be having a discussion. But one thing that did strike me was the importance of thinking about the time investment it takes to do this history. It's not something you can write up quickly, and it's an ongoing, growing history that you continue to learn from, and it takes time to do archival work or archaeological work. It takes time to sit with the material you gather. It takes time to educate young people how to do this work, and that what you get as a result is a really rich history, multi-layered and living history. So I think that's something that is coming through with all of your work. The methodology that it takes to do this history right takes an investment in time, and sometimes academia doesn't really give us much time to sit with this and to do it right. So I think that community investment part of it is really important, but also that acknowledgement of the time it takes. Okay, questions from the floor? Yes. You? Oh, never mind.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful conference. My name is Jill Strauss, and I was left yesterday afternoon and am continuing to struggle with I believe that there are distinctions between history and legacy. So are these shared histories or are these contested histories? Is it a shared legacy, or are they different legacies? I'm co-editing an anthology of, this is also coming out of, and the reason that I'm here is because I'm co-editing an anthology of memoirs by descendants of enslaved people and or enslaved holders, and members of Coming to the Table, which I'm also a member of. And if anybody would like more information about Coming to the Table later, I'm happy to tell you. But in the meantime, so our title is Shared Legacies, and I'm like, is where are, this has all been problematized for me, and I was wondering what everybody in the room is thinking about that, and of course our speakers as well.
Well, to me, history are really the dates, the times, what happened. Legacy are what remains of what happened. So when I talk about the legacy or the traces of the colonial past, I'm talking about what's left after it happened. So I think we debate a little bit about shared history. I know Wayne is over there clevering his eyes because he doesn't particularly care for that idea of shared history. But there was an aspect of it that was shared. It wasn't equal. Of course, there were power dynamics. There were differences in how that experience for the different groups. But there is still something that was shared or common. And the legacy to me is, again, what remains? What are the traces of that history? That's how I see it. Yes, you agree that, and David agrees with me. Thank you, David, so much. Oh, that wasn't.
Sure, I agree with you. Ibrahim, I want to give you a chance to go a little further explaining those issues you raised, both the problem of the slave status and the way it endures in West African cultures, Senegal, and also the extraordinary, to Americans anyway, it often seems an extraordinary difference in the reaction that an American will have at a site like Gorée or Elmina or any of the rest of the slave sites versus the reactions of Africans who tend to go to the issue of economic, inequality and economic trouble. There is so much in that story, it seems to me, about the way the slave trade broke cultures, broke stories, even though people survive, that is still there in the sheer differences of those reactions. I just, everyone only gets 10 to 15 minutes, but, say a little more about that, of how you actually interpret that, both of those things.
I think that in the Americas, the descendant can look back and see, although there are still issues related to slavery, but they can see that there is an opportunity sometime to discuss this, and it has been evolving towards something. What troubled me, particularly in the case of Senegal and large parts of West Africa, when it's something that is ascribed. I think that we're not really doing a good job in educating. We're not doing a good job addressing publicly the issue and giving a chance to descendants and empowering them so that they could really move forward and look at themselves as full citizens. I think that is extremely important, and I think that their memories need to be collected. We need to have them tell their own side of the story. There are some who are resistant, who wouldn't talk much, but there are more and more actually who openly discuss this, and they are in Senegal, in northern Senegal. There's even an association of descendants. This is just something happening over the past 2-3 years. So I think that there is something cooking, but it's not yet there. I think that in terms of education, I think that we need to deal more with that. When it comes to the Maison des Esclaves, the different perspective, I think that for a long time, the way it was portrayed, the way slavery was portrayed, it was in the Maison des Esclaves, it was viewed as Africa versus Europe, as blackness versus whiteness, and the local dynamics. All these stories that I discussed, they're not displayed in any local museum, but the Maison des Esclaves discussed the transatlantic slavery, which was certainly something extremely important that shaped who we are. But I think that there was also some extremely important local dynamics that we should not miss. I think that it is important that we understand those processes before being able to really address fully the transatlantic. I think that the local dynamics that led to enslavement, that led to the deportation and exile, I think all of those need to be linked together and gives, one and foremost, the most important issue, create the opportunity for conversation between descendants in the diaspora and descendants in Africa. Give them the opportunity to get together and discuss. I think this would unravel a lot of things that we haven't yet addressed. Thank you.
My question kind of follows exactly on that. I remember being at a Panafest in Ghana, and there was some considerable conflict and consternation between different communities because one of the venues that was used for performance was Cape Coast Castle, which was a town hall and had been for many centuries for people living in the local community, and was a sacred site for diaspora returnees who were quite offended by the thought that this was being used as a venue for certain kinds of performances. But that gets at a point, and it just in some ways echoes what you've just said. You know, what fascinates me with these moments is that with those sites, those castles, is that the very where they sit and the very architecture of them and their rectilinearity and all of those things conveys them as these kind of European or Western impositions on the landscape, as they were. But the lived experience of people who passed through them, those were not the originary points. Those were really bottlenecks, right? In that, you know, that people came from, and so they can actually function, in effect, as historical screens, you know, that in effect what we see and what people experience and the way the stories and the pilgrimages are constructed when people visit those sites and are asked to go back through the door of no return, as it's conventionally called, is in effect to prioritize or make the originary moment, the moment in which African people are catapulted out into the maelstrom of the Atlantic, and to leave the entire history of how those people found themselves at that place, often from hundreds and hundreds of miles into the interior, often over periods of months, years, generations, to get to that spot before they're catapulted out. That aspect of the history kind of gets lost. I mean, so the whole thing is sort of predicated on a notion of Africa as a unitary place and home, which is itself an artifact of the trade, rather than something that would have had meaning in the lives of the people who were themselves being transported through it. I guess in some ways the broader point to sort of make it for, I mean, anyone who wants to comment, you know, is that these places that we're constructing and that we're offering people to have these kinds of cathartic experiences, we're also crafting or reproducing certain kinds of narratives, which, as much as we congratulate ourselves on unearthing new histories, also do works of obscuring histories too. And I just wonder if anybody wants to talk about that.
If I could just not really touch on that point, but go back to the original point, your original question of legacy and history. And to a degree of what you have just said, 40% of, we believe, 40% of the enslaved Africans buried in the burial ground were Muslim. Okay? We don't know the percentage of the indigenous population that was buried in the burial ground, but it's there. And there is a percentage of, one would say, white individuals buried in the burial ground as well. The aspect of legacy and history, there are beads that came from Africa that are in the archives that I'll never take out and they'll never see the light of day. But they came through the Middle Passage and they're with us here. So there was a sense of history. There was a sense of community stemming from Africa with the burial of the enslaved Africans in New York. That was brought over from Africa. So I don't know if that sort of answers your question or if it's...
Yes, I'd like to, here on your left on the stage, I am Jacques Marcel here. I'd like to ask Ibrahim something. You said that, I'm not sure I understood very well. You said that some people were claiming in Senegal, saying, we are slaves, still slaves. Do you mean that for these people or in these places, slavery is still relevant, or is still is a sort of a statute for people? And is there, in that case, a difference between that, slavery, and the slave trade and deportation that talks about our history? Because this is something I was, I'm surprised to hear that. And are we talking about the same thing and the same process and slavery, if I have understood well?
Thank you. Yes, I think this it can be very troubling. Legally, there are no slaves in Senegal. But socially, if I can put it that way, there are still people who are still regarded as slaves, who know their position during social gathering. There are things that they can and cannot say, and this is extremely important. And it's not only Senegal; it goes beyond. So it's not that maybe the owner, and they're related to specific families, for sure. But of course, they cannot mistreat them as it was happening years back, certainly. But they still have some sort of relations of dependence that look like some sort of clientage. And that's how it is expressed. And also some sort of economic relations. This is all over large parts of West Africa, not even Senegal.
I wanted to answer the question you asked about you were talking about the forts. And we were fortunate to travel to Senegal and meet with one of my favorite people, Dr. Cha. And we had some really great conversations about the activity on Gorée and the relationships between Europeans and folks from Gorée, African descent. We also talked about indigenous religion versus, Islam entering into that space. And so it informed us about how we set up the entry hall when you go into Slavery and Freedom. So when you first come off the elevator, we made sure that we contextualize the story and look at it from the first time you step off the elevator. We don't start with slavery. We start with Africa, looking at it as a continent, but made up of diverse people, places, culture, intellect, societies, communities. We wanted to break that down from the very beginning. And then as you go down the entry hall, we made sure that we share that people didn't see themselves as Africans or Europeans at the time, just during this early period. The other thing is that we looked at exactly what you said. People think of the door of no return and even the forts along that western coast, but don't necessarily, like our average visitor, may not have thought, I'm going to start to learn about from the time you're captured from the interior and the entire process of becoming enslaved. So we made sure that we unpacked that. But it wasn't enough to just unpack that through labeled text. It was important to let first-person voices carry that space, to say, this is what it felt like, this is what it was like for me. So I appreciate your question, because we tried to do exactly that before you even get to this kind of artistic, poetic film treatment where we look at that, and this gets to legacy and history too. We look at forts along the western coast, and it gives you this sense of all this commerce going on, but what that human experience was like to ultimately leave the coast. So
I also think it's important, too, that we remind ourselves that African history didn't begin with slavery, that there was a history that was alive and thriving, not perfect, of course, but we tend to focus on the European invasion as the beginning of history, and in many places that we had to sort of reframe that to make sure we remind ourselves that we have to look even further back, and not romanticize African history also, because people tend to do that. You know, media has done a wonderful job of romanticizing, and we have to be mindful that it's complicated, as Dr. had said, it's complex, it's layered, and there's not one single story. And how do you weave together a history so that it shares the complexities on both sides of that?
well, it doesn't start with slavery, but we do address that slavery existed in Africa. So, but that's not where we open the door to this exhibition. And so it's important that we include that in there as well. We do address that. And in terms of legacy and history, shared history. You know, one of the things we talked about in doing design for the exhibition was, you know, you've heard me say profit and power juxtaposed against the human cost. And we have a document in the section on the transatlantic slave trade, and it's an indenture, and it shows where the generations are handing down wealth. And it's a family in Jamaica, and these aunts and uncles are handing down wealth to the next generation. Land, property, in this instance, enslaved African men, women, and children. But then, as you look at the case, you see running along the bottom the continuation of enslaving an African. Right? So what's the legacy that you see out of this shared history? Together, Europeans and Africans built this Atlantic world, but the legacy, you see them right there with each other. So you see the story of the domestic slave trade with Isaac Franklin and James Armfield, and Isaac Franklin makes all this money, and he takes his profit and he turns it into power, and he buys 8 plantations, and one of which is Angola Plantation, and the legacy continues where you see the Angola Guard Tower in the section on segregation, and then you see the Angola prison cell in our exhibit on the power of place. That's legacy. And that legacy did not extend to everybody else. Its legacy of slavery very much carried on the bodies of African Americans.
And I want to piggyback off of that just for a second. When we're working with students down in St. Croix and they're beginning to understand local history, sometimes for the first time and stuff, the legacy that had been told by the Park Service for a really long time was this Danish military history and Danish colonialism and plantations, and then there were these enslaved Africans. And we try to twist that a little bit and say, who built these buildings? Enslaved Africans. As you're digging this stuff up, it's not that they were just put to work, they were put to work to build the buildings that then they were actually enslaved in. And trying to twist a little bit so that these students, high school students and hopefully eventually junior high students and getting down into the lower grades can actually think about, wait a minute, this is my history in so many different ways that I could never even conceive of in the first place.
Thanks for a wonderful set of presentation. I've been beckoned, so I respond to this beckoning. I gave a talk in the Netherlands recently, and we were talking about this concept because in the Netherlands we have a concept called shared heritage, which is a policy concept that brings the Dutch together with other part of the imperial formation. And we were giving a talk, and the question was raised about who is the target audience for an exhibition on slavery. Mm-hmm. And after the talk, because I was insistent that the target audience must be all of us, that all of us are involved in this. And that's why I like Lonnie Bunch's statement where he says that it is the American history through the lens of. But this woman came up to me and she said, wow, I cannot believe that because I've never thought that this history was my history. This history is the history of Surinamese people. And in museum practice, we often, and policy practice, the notion of shared lacks a politics sometimes. And so when I say that I'm not interested in the shared, or that I don't support it, it is when we think shared without the politics. What does it mean to share a history? Mm-hmm. And how do we come to that history differently in exhibitionary forms? Because one of the struggles that as an exhibition maker one has is, which is a strange thing, is if a population that you're trying to address does not think that that is something for them. And I'm sorry, museums are marketing spaces as well. So the marketing, we have the urgency as curators to think that we're going to do good work, but then we have a marketing department to ask us, who are we doing the good work for? Mm-hmm. So in that marketing logic, how do we come to an exhibitionary form which beckons both the enslaver and the formerly enslaved? Because that is where we come to a politics of shared, where both can come to that history and see that history as a part of who they are and a part of their own implicatedness in the present, in that past. And that is where my struggle with the notion of shared comes from. Because if we can't do that differently implicated in it, then what we do is that we say that the history of slavery is, and the exhibitions about slavery is for black people. And that is where I have a problem.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Actually, my undergrad degree is in marketing. So, that said, and this wasn't a marketing ploy or tool, but Nancy, I think, can tell you that we had many conversations about what to include in the exhibition and how we make sure that there's this shared sense of history and how we, who our audience is and how we want to draw people in to see themselves, themselves in the exhibition. The other day, the gentleman who wrote Homecoming, his presentation, and he talked about enslaved black men who were raped. And one of the things that we had a long discussion about was the representation of black men in our exhibition. And we talk about women being raped and the brutality towards women, but you can't leave out the story of the experience of the man, right? We have to include that. When we look at this exhibition, and if I have, we have African Americans coming through, white Americans coming through, Asian Pacific Islander, Latino. We looked at everything, including connections to the diaspora. We looked at class. We looked at, you heard me mention, so we have to make sure that someone sees themselves. If they say, my family, and let's say they can show, in fact, their family did not own enslaved people, but they still have a story that's part of this building the nation. And that includes, again, enslaved African, free people of color, poor white, yeoman white farmer, and planter elite. Because I agree with you. Oftentimes I've been to exhibitions and it leans one way or the other. And so when we say that this museum opens September 24th and the tickets are gone through March and we haven't issued any new tickets, and it is a 45-minute wait to go down into the history gallery, and we try to give incentives for people to go elsewhere in the museum. But they're going down, and when they come out, and I can tell you because I've talked to folks, they say, I've seen myself in this exhibition. And they say, I want to come back. I didn't get to read all the labels. And they say, I'm telling my friends and my family to come to this museum. And whether it's black or white, many people are not expecting what they actually see in the exhibition because of how we told the story. And so I don't know that that's really responsive to what you're saying, but I understand what you're saying, but we dug deep to try and make sure that we had a cross-section of representation in the exhibit, because we want people to see, while it says African American history and culture through the African American lens, it's still looked out on a cross-section of people in the world, and this is a place for everybody. Yeah.
You have one up there,
Yeah.
and Professor Bogues.
Yes, hi.
You're up.
Two questions to Jennifer Tausch, mostly to you. The first one is, have you considered developing any other similar projects of the legacy of slavery associated to the Dutch slave trade elsewhere, for instance, in the Caribbean? I was thinking, for instance, on the large Luango communities in northwestern Venezuela, made out of mostly from runaway slaves from Curaçao. And the second question is if there is any sort of collaboration within the European Union with other similar institutions, for instance, the Comité pour l'Histoire et la Mémoire de l'Esclavage en France, or the Memorial in Nantes, or in Guadeloupe. And if there isn't, shouldn't there be a more closer collaboration? For instance, in Barcelona, they have just set up a route of slavery in the city center of Barcelona. And they're facing the same problems, prominent figures, statues, buildings associated to the people, the wealthy people who made money out of slavery. So I think they could learn a lot if there was a closer collaboration within Europe. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the question, and actually that's the whole point of the Mapping Slavery Project aspect of what we do, is partnering with these other institutions. And of course, the whole goal is really to expand this concept of the Dutch colonial empire. And so we have projects, for example, Nancy just came back from Indonesia, because Indonesia obviously was part of that story. Curaçao, of course, we have our partners there in Curaçao. So what we really appreciate about the symposiums and the programs that we do is to invite more partners, to invite more organizations and institutions, the non-traditional, if you will, as well, to share the connections, because we don't know all of that. We're relying also on the public and academia and different practitioners to infuse into what we already know to expand that story. So we started off, I think, with about 40 sites, for example, just in New York State. We're now having to cut it off because we're over 75. It keeps growing because the more we learn, the more information that we receive from other people to help us fill in those gaps. So if you have those ideas, we welcome them and invite you to share them. So please come up at the end.
Yeah, thank you. If I could go back just a bit about this question of slavery in Africa. I think three things. One is that there is the necessity for a conversation between Africans in the diaspora and Africans around this question of slavery and the journeys from the interior to the coast. But I also think that, and that is a discussion around the business of the relationship between African elites and European elites around the business of this trade in human flesh. But I also think it's important that to understand that the movement from the coast across the Atlantic was a historical rupture as well, because it didn't just continue a certain kind of slavery. It actually created a different kind of slavery, one which was organized around questions of race. African slavery, which existed, was organized around debt bondage, caste system, ethnic relations, etc. The question of racialization in the ways that we have come to understand it, is a phenomenon which grows up or grew out of, emerged out of that particular moment. And so there is a transformation that happens. And it is that transformation that I think the African American, and I mean just when I say African American, I mean African American writ large, the Africans in the Americas. It is that transformation that even if it is not at Goree Island, or even if we get the place wrong, the actual sites wrong, it is at that point where people think they left to become somebody else. It is at that moment where I think you see the kind of emotions that you are talking about in the book. And I just think it is, in thinking about history, this is not a smooth history from the Congo Kingdom through parts of North Africa, then down onto West Coast, and then into one of the forts on the West Coast. That in fact it is a complicated history which has moments of transformation in it for the actual persons who are involved in that story. And so that I agree that we need to tell the story from the beginning, but we also need to tell the story at its points of transformation and what actually occurs and where new things actually happen. That then begins to force the thing through. So because when we then think of legacy, I've spent hours talking to Ibrahim about this, in particular in Cape Town. When we think about legacies and you think about how those legacies work, they work different ways. And so that the actual racialized body in this part of the world, in the Americas, in Europe, and so on, signifies something else. Right? Signifies a certain kind of legacy that I think is constructed around a certain kind of biology, if you wish. Where I think a certain kind of legacy in parts of Africa is really signified or works itself around questions of status. Right? And that those status are not necessarily identified in terms of physicality, but identified through history or identified through a certain kind of certain kind of ethnic group that you may belong to. So I just want to make that point to say that it's complicated, it's not smooth, and that there are moments of rupture when different things are created. And it's important to understand those different things.
Nancy? And then we have one more, the last comment and question.
I just wanted to make a few comments, and I think it kind of piggybacks a little bit on what Tony was saying. But one thing that I really noticed is the notion of exclusion and lack of belonging that really ran through most of the panels. And I hear what Tony's saying, that perhaps in the African case it's more status, but I think it's certainly something worth examining, because I think it is a product of this particular moment. And it kind of leads back to what Wayne was saying about actually putting the politics into it. So I was wondering about in St. Croix, when you're working with the students, what politics do they bring to the situation? Are they, that they can be discovering and learning things about their past, but what are they bringing to this, and are they speaking back? And then one other thing I would love for us to circle back and talk about this notion of shared history again, because I think our museum was kind of trying to explore and experiment with how we actually try to make this a history for all Americans and to get everyone through the door, and that there are certain strategies and tactics we used, and maybe explore some of those at some point to actually kind of unpack. And none of this was actually above board. I think we'd all just carry our own interpretations about like what were the strategies and tactics we were using and what's kind of working and what's not.
So in St. Croix, it was interesting. So for several of the students, and then even for some of the younger kids, of the high school students, when they were really learning about some of this history, you were watching them go through like the 7 stages, right? So there was like anger and all of this, all these reactions like, why haven't we been learning this? What are our teachers getting paid for? All of that kind of stuff. And then there was, well, wait a minute. So you mean this place over here, this is where this happened? Oh, that's why my grandmother used to always say this stuff and why this place is named this. I never knew that. You could really see it connect. One of our interns, Jordan, who's continuing with the program for this summer, he's jumped in, feet first. He's all into it. He's learning how to dive and everything. He started working on restoring his grandmother's house in Christiansted. I mean, just like he wants to go into business. He's not going to become a historian or an archaeologist. He knows kind of what he wants to do, but now he's embracing that past and looking into, well, what about fixing up the houses in Christiansted? I can make an industry out of that, but he can start to make that connection with his own family's history. So you can see it very quickly and very directly as they start to accept that, okay, that's in the past, we didn't learn that, but now we can move forward and learn more.
And Jordan's family, they started one of the first black newspapers. And so it's not just a matter of, I want to restore my grandmother's house because it's my grandmother's house.
Yeah.
It's, I want to restore this historic site that was very pivotal to the development of the community and having a deeper understanding of what that meant for a community that came out of, slavery, and what his family did, their legacy of helping to build up the community with that heritage. Yep.
I know a lot of people can think, like slavery, that there are all sorts of issues today, like if I'm a teenager today. So that why am I going back and exploring this particular thing when there are these really urgent political matters that I want to address today? Are you seeing like an interplay where they're bringing those issues up, or are they making connections?
For the most part, it's been through, for example, when there's discussions about Black Lives Matter.
Right.
And even if you take it outside of St. Croix, we have young people who talk about that when they go through the Emmett Till space in our own museum, But that is something that the young people have talked about when we've done radio interviews. And we've done radio interviews in St. Croix. Dr. Chinzira Davis Kahina, who is at the University of Virgin Islands, she hosts an online radio show that's regional. And so she's had members from the Slave Rex Project, as well as students, local students, talk about what this means, the project itself. And so they've talked about how it informs them about where they are now and helps them have a deeper understanding about how to move forward. But they look at it also through their current lived experience, thinking about Black Lives Matter and all this history that comes with it. No different than just what I shared about when I'm in segregation and I tell people to look down at the Slavery and Freedom exhibition and think about domestic slave trade, Angola plantation, and now you're standing in front of the Angola Guard Tower and think about the prison industrial complex.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for wonderful presentations. There's a lot of things to consider. I'm interested in this image of the future of the past that I think you presented. And there are a number of things that go to that. One is, how do we deal with residues of sites, which is what you've been doing, kind of archaeology of memory at some level. But the remains of sites are remains until someone acts on them, meaning someone works on them as what we call memory work, the work of memory, not only the physical work, but the work of the mind. And there's another thing that to me was extremely interesting and is very complex at the level of both curatorial or designing projects, which is that we are dealing with a history that is, I think, as Tony mentioned before, is a bit of and I think Ibrahima mentioned the interruption, the interruption of history. So in a certain way, there is a question of a bit of a problematic word, which is mastery of a subject that cannot be mastered, which I think, Mary, you mentioned, no one really knows what it feels to be there. Mm-hmm. So how do we work through the problems of teaching pedagogically, working with new generations, of a history that at some level cannot be mastered because it's a history of trauma at some level, So that basically requires, which I hope to see it soon, which requires, I would say, a different approach that is not a kind of a traditional linear cumulative, pedagogic approach over the subject of the work that we're doing, which requires, I think, a kind of a combination of work on imagination, interpretation, but allowing the mind to open a void in the present, And for me, the concept of the void, it's a physical concept, is something that requires, for us, designers, curators, historians, understand that there's a moment that there's a space that we cannot access, and that void, in a certain way, is one of the problems, let's say, of historical museums, that basically I see them as incredibly important spaces to think about this, but I don't see the kind of interruption, or I would love to see more of the kind of notion of the interruption itself. And I think, Mary, you mentioned that in your eloquent speech, and I think all of you as well. But I would like to see that more for future generations. How do we address that notion, interrupting the present, so that the voices of the past can somehow filter through?
Mm-hmm. I would like to say something about that, because the slide that I used, which really resonated for me, what I've experienced at the historic sites, and all the sites that we visit, by the way, are already constructed. So they are the remains of the original owners, or the grave sites, the burial grounds, not necessarily but the National Park Service burial grounds, but the actual burial grounds that are memorialized by the region that they're located in. And something happens, and we're talking also about authenticity, because there are these historic sites that have been operating for years that are in some ways hidden in plain sight. They're not on the mainstream pathway, but I Love New York, for example, has this program called Pathway Through History, where they're trying to encourage people to get out of the cityscape, to go beyond the, New York City, people tend to think of only as Manhattan, Midtown. They don't realize that New York City includes the 5 boroughs, that also, reaching beyond that. So getting people outside of that mindset. And my colleague Nancy also talks about the city as the archive. The archive is the locations, and something else is triggered, is invoked when you're in the location where you know the ancestor that we're talking about, and that's not just the African descendant or ancestry. We're talking about the European ancestry as well, or the Native Americans, where you can imagine something else when you're standing on their hallowed ground, when you're revisiting their experience or looking at the documents where they wrote themselves. And a lot of these historic sites, the smaller ones, have the actual archival documents still in their presence. So one of the things that we had to do was to work on reinterpreting their narrative, to be more inclusive. We talked about exclusion, is so that they could broaden it, because a lot of these sites think, well, nobody wants to know about the slavery past, so they leave it out. But by leaving it out, you're changing what really happened there. So it's also about reinterpreting and reframing, reclaiming. A lot of that happens, and then it invokes something within each person, because they have a different experience based on their ancestry. So there is a way of being more creative. I think the historic sites realize that they have to do something else, and marketing is a part of that, because they want to attract more visitors, more unique visitors, and in order to do that, you have to give people a reason to think there's something that I will locate there about my own heritage. So it's a process, and the interesting thing also is in Amsterdam, the tour that we do there, it's one guide, 20 sites. When you're talking about something that's a multi-day, this is really 3 days and 2 nights, you've got 20 sites, 20 different interpretations. How do they link to each other? That's a challenge. And so we did a lot of work with individual sites, actually visiting the sites ourselves to talk to them about this history that they've left out of their story. So it is a very time-consuming. You talked about time and money. Let's not forget it takes resources, financial resources. So anybody out there that has any financial resources, I'm pitching for that too, because we are independent researchers. We are doing this with a lot of support from our partners, and we get very creative in how do we to restructure this so that we can produce books and tours and maps, etc. So that's
I would like to wrap this up, even though there's so much left to discuss. Thank you so much for everything, and to the audience as well.